Have you ever put yourself in a situation where you knew you didn't have control, you didn't know how to get out of it, and all you could do was pray that somehow, some way you could? There I was sitting in a car in Clinton, Maryland. It was a blue Geo Prism. It was my first car. I was a I was a senior in high school, and I'm sitting in my car thinking, I'm getting ready to throw my entire life away. Now, at that time, I had finished high school early. I went to a private school in Tacoma Park, Maryland. Finished high school early, finished in January. I just had to wait to May because I finished all my classes early. So I'm at home hanging with the local kids who had already retired, but they did. I mean, not retired, but already graduated from college. I mean, high school, and some didn't, um, and really didn't have any future. But they were all the kids that were available. And so I found myself with those kids. And during that time period, we had a quote unquote beef in the neighborhood. And I was one of the few kids that had a car. And so that night, I went out and they were like, hey, hop in, let's ride out, which was the word. And we're riding out to handle a beef that we had with another neighborhood. And the intent that night was to really end this kid's life that was at another party. And I didn't get word of that till we were halfway to the destination. And so in that moment, I'm sitting in my car next to another friend of mine, and we're both terrified. And I know for myself, I'm sitting there like, how am I going to get out of this situation? And as the night went on, the person who we were there to quote unquote deal with never came out. And I vowed to myself that day that I'm never going to put myself in situations that one, I can't control, and I'm not ever going to put myself around people who don't have anything to lose. And so that has been my mantra my entire life from that moment. I went on to college and here I am now in front of you and the other three people I was with. Two of them are no longer here and one is locked up. And so, how's that relevant to you? This year, we have gotten so many calls at Fed Legacy from people who are in a similar situation as I was, feeling like they're in situations where they're stuck. They don't know what's going to happen next. They're hoping that letters don't come or emails don't come that ends their federal career. And, a lot of those folks weren't ready. There's one person in particular who was a client of ours. She'd been a client of ours for 7 years. And she had that moment in the car moment 7 years ago where she told me, she's like, Will, I don't like my boss and I need you to help me be able to put myself in a situation where when I retire, it's on my terms. And so fast forward to 7 years, she reminded me of that conversation when we talked this year when everything was going on with Doge and things like that. And she said, well, because of the conversation we had 7 years ago, I think I'm ready. I don't like all this toxic energy that's going on in my office. Like, let's review my numbers. And we had already done it on an annual basis anyway. But she said, let's really look at these numbers. Because, since we've been talking 7 years, I've applied everything we've talked about. And I think I can do this. And this lady didn't get like riff notices, nothing like that. She just couldn't take the toxicity. She's like, look, I don't want to work in an environment where I don't have a mission, where I feel like my coworkers are backstabbing me. I just don't want to be in that position because she was high up. And we went through the numbers and she walked away. And this lady was in her early 50s. And she just said, you know what? They still want to keep me, but I'm not staying. I'm walking out on my own terms. And she's happier than ever right now. Right. And so, and every day at Fed Legacy, we run into the people who are just looking for their way out, looking for ways to control their narrative, looking for ways to live their best life the way they want to. And so tonight, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the 5 lessons that I've learned along the way this year from talking to hundreds and hundreds of folks, and then my team talking to hundreds of folks. And so I want to give you those 5 because it's our last webinar for the year. And we'll be right back at it, in January. But it's our last one for the year. So I want to, go over those 5 lessons for you to walk you through to a point where you have control of your financial destiny. There's no more power than that, right? Government jobs are great, but there's no more power than when you're ready to retire, you just do. Or you don't like your boss, you're like, you know what, I'm out. That's the financial freedom that a lot of folks are looking for. And it feels so great when you're talking to people and they're saying, look, well, I don't have to take this and I'm out. And we go through the plans like, yeah, peace. Tell them you're out, And so I want to go over that with you all today. So here are the 5 lessons, right? 1, your pension is your superpower. A lot of federal employees look at the news and they think, okay, I need to have some level of fear around retirement, like most people in the country do, right? And so because of what you hear on the news, is like you got to have over $1 million saved in the TSP. Nothing wrong with having over $1 million saved, no question about that. But for federal employees, it's a bit different because your pension is your superpower. And the one thing that we've learned this year, when so many people had to retire before they thought they would need to, is that the pension is what saved them. When you're getting $2,800 to $4,000, depending on where you are, in income every year, plus your plus cost of living increases, it makes a difference when it comes to retirement planning. So the reason why lesson 1 is so important is because a lot of the stress that a lot of people have is just because you've never sat down with someone and really planned it out. And so why is number 1 so important? You want to make sure you sit with someone and just run your numbers. It's almost like with most things, if you just let it sit off in the back of your mind and you worry about it, you ruminate over it, that can cause you a lot of stress. Then when you just face it and look at it, you're like, oh, wow, that wasn't as scary as I thought it was. And that's one of the lessons that we learned as a team this year is like, man, federal employees got it good when it comes to that pension and how it works as the cost of living increases go up. It just solves so many problems. Lesson number 2 is just generic advice is expensive. This is another one that we saw a lot in 2025 because now, I'm sure you all see it on your Facebook feed. We've been doing this, doing Facebook marketing, Facebook on YouTube. We've been doing that since 2016. So we've been doing that a while. But I'm sure you all have seen a lot of people now all of a sudden they're federal employee experts because they know federal employees, because all the drama surrounding federal employees. And so you see all these new federal employee specialists out of nowhere. 5 years ago, we were the only ones, pretty much. Us in First Command, or like it wasn't many. Wasn't many people. It was Fed Legacy and them. But now you see all types of people popping up. And so what I've learned in that, because I've talked to a lot of folks that have talked to other people, is that a lot of times they're given generic advice, but it's expensive. And the reason why it's expensive is because federal employees, your benefit plan is very different. And if the people don't know it, they can cause you to make very expensive mistakes. Like one of the things we see a lot of is people trying to get people to buy income annuities, saying you want to buy these income annuities and things like that. Federal employees just don't need that stuff, right? But you can put a lot of money and lock it up because someone is so used to private industry. And private industry, yes, income annuity is very important because that helps them create a pension where they won't have one. Whereas a federal employee, you have a pension, so you don't necessarily need to lock up that type of money. Another thing that we've seen a lot of is people trying to get folks to put more than, and this kind of goes into lesson number 3, is trying to get them to put the majority of their money into very safe investments, right? No, as a federal employee, it's very different because your pension is so powerful, going back to 1, that you don't have to be as conservative in your investments as someone who has, let's just use the number of million because everybody wants to have it. If you're in the private sector, you have $1 million in your 401k. That's not a lot of money because that $1 million has to pay for your income for the rest of your life. That $1 million has to deal with your long-term care. That $1 million has to be your travel budget. That $1 million has to be your family emergency. And that money can go quite quick when you don't have a pension. And so you got people that come in with this generic advice and they're coming to talk to the federal employees. They're like, hey, look, you want to throw 80% of your money into this low risk investment. That doesn't make sense for federal employees because federal employees, you have a pension, so you could be a bit more aggressive with your investments, right? And then you have to strike the right balance, right? So that generic advice is expensive. That goes also to the 50-50. If you're a federal employee, you shouldn't be putting more than 50% of your money into extremely conservative investments, right? No more than 50, 60/40, fine. More than 50, that's a little bit much, right? So the 50/50 rule held up. And the reason why I say it held up is because as we looked at even during the April downturn in the market, as we looked at, you know, the year as everything as the TSP started to bounce back, clients might have panicked for 1 month, but over time, everything balanced out. And so that rule held up for us as we were talking to a lot of clients. And then when we look at it over a time period, because we've been now doing this for 17 years, when those folks were still coming talking to us, the things we talked to them about years ago still held up, right? And so that was good. And then number 4 is timing the market doesn't work. Here's why I say that. When April hit, the market went down about 15% in April this year. And so when that happened, a lot of folks were moving money to the G fund, and it makes sense. I mean, you're not day traders. That the news is scary, and so people were moving the money to the G fund. And then in May, they were thinking about moving it back, and it was just trying to time it perfectly because every day there was a new news flipping out. And so what we realized, because we don't know what's going to happen, especially under this presidency, and so you just can't time it based on the news. And so what we learned is, like, again, you can't time the market. You got to have a strategy, and you got to stick to that strategy. You got to stick to that strategy, because if you stick to that strategy, you don't run the risk of being locked in the basement. I talk about this all the time, and I'm gonna explain it to you. I'm gonna explain it to you what I mean by locked in the basement. It's a term I made up, but it's a good analogy, right? And so when the market drops, oftentimes people, so let's say a person has 500,000 in the TSP, okay? Actually, let's make it 100,000 to make the math easier so you can follow me, right? So let's say a person has 100,000 in the TSP and the market drops a bit, and you're like, okay, I'm taking all my money out of the C fund and I'm moving it all to the G fund because you're afraid. You're looking at the news, you're like, oh no, we're about to go to war. Oh no, we're about to do this. And so your money drops from 100,000 to 80,000 because there was a 20% drop. And then you put that money into the G fund. You say, all right, I'm playing safe now. I'm not losing no more money. Boom, my money's in the G fund. Then you sit there and you're like, I'll move it when everything clears up. We don't know when this stuff's going to clear up. And so all of a sudden it's one day, and all of a sudden you see the market jumped up 10%. Like, oh, the market was good. That you're looking at the news, listening to the WTOP if you're in the DC area, like, all right, cool. Like, I'm about to move my money back. And so because you see that 10%, so you're like, all right, I'm gonna let my money out the basement. The market went up 10%. You now move your money back to the C. That next day, Monday, because there's always corrections, especially in the market drops back down another 3%. So now your 80,000 is down because you missed the 10% uptick. And now for the rest of the year, the market goes up little increments every day. You've missed the big spike days. And so in the market, there's a couple of spike days a year, but mostly every day is back and forth between 2, -2, 2, 1. And then all of a sudden at the end of the year, you're like, oh, the market was 14%. But there's a bunch of those little days and then some big days. And so what you can't do is, if you miss those big days when the market bounces back after you've returned, after you moved it, you lock yourself in the basement because now you're struggling trying to get out of it, waiting for another big day, but you really can't time it. And so what I'm telling you, like I tell people all the time, have a strategy and stick with it, because timing the market just doesn't work. The people that we talk to, that in the term is popular, TSP millionaires, what they always say is, yep, I met this coworker when I first started. They told me put all my money in CNS, and I just left it there. I didn't even change it ever. I forgot to change it. And now when I look, I got, 700,000, million, but they're not chasing the market. And so timing the market doesn't work, especially if you looked at the market this year, because, this year was unpredictable. And so the next one is crisis creates opportunity. Here's what I mean by that. This year, I've had some really good conversations with federal employees who didn't think they were going to be able to retire, who were afraid to have the retirement conversation, but was forced to have the conversation because they had no choice, because they just didn't know what was going to happen. And when we had those conversations, I would say the vast majority of those conversations started off with a terrified person, and at the end, it was a very relieved person. And here's why I say that. Because if you're as a federal government employee, going back to your pension being your superpower, you have a really good benefit package. All you have to do is make small tweaks for the most part, and you can have a pretty decent retirement. But if you don't make those small tweaks, there's surprises that could come up, like taxes, big tax bill when your RMDs hit, or if you want to leave your kids a bunch of money, and RMDs meaning requirement minimum distribution. You know, if you go to leave your kids money, they could be hit with a big tax bill. If you don't manage your bills properly, then there could be issues when it comes to whether your pension and your Social Security cover your expenses, you know, things like that. Or you leave your money in the G fund and you think you're safe, but then when you realize, whoa, like I was talking to a guy the other day, this guy was buttoned up. I mean, real buttoned up guy, like high up in the government, very conservative, very conservative. Like I don't think he laughed until our second call and maybe like 45 minutes into that call, but just very serious. And like we were just talking about, you know, his investments, and he was just talking about the G fund. And because he was so buttoned up, I was like, all right, let me just show you this. And so when I showed him the difference between the G fund and what he could have had in the C fund, I mean, he just like, oh, Mrs. Smith, oh man, wow, I did not know that, you know? And so why does that create opportunity? It creates opportunity because it forced more people to take care of their finances. And when you begin to take control of your finances, your whole life changed. Like I have a client, Ms. Laura, I talked about her last week. When we talked, you know, we did our thing. This is about 10 years ago. And she had no clue what she was going to do in retirement. Now she lives in North Carolina. She bought the lot next to her. Her sister lives behind her. Another one of her sisters lives about 5 minutes down the road, and they're living their best life in North Carolina, buying up investment properties down there because they're just living intentional. They started to invest their money in a certain way, and now they're living intentional. I have clients who buy properties overseas, right? Clients who lived in the DC area, now they live in South Carolina, you know, on the water, like just living really good lives because they got intentional. And so crisis creates opportunity because crisis creates opportunity for you to dream. Even here at Fed Legacy, we weren't doing these webinars every Wednesday night until I saw Trump was going to get elected. And I said to myself personally, as I was sitting there, and I was like, all right, my people really need me right now. I got to do this every Wednesday. We weren't doing these before I saw that he was going to get elected. It creates opportunity. And so it creates conversation. When times like this happen, we have to step up, you know. And so say that to you all because it's an opportunity for you to get your financial situations in order so y'all can live intentional lives. And so the next thing, and this is the structure that we always talk about here at Fed Legacy, is just building your financial house going into 2026. Just making sure you have your foundation laid, you know, making sure you understand your pension, understand your Social Security planning, how you're going to do that, you know, because those two things are fixed and you really can't do much about them other than work longer or politic and get or you know higher up on the GS scale. But those things hold you down in retirement. Those are the foundation. Your income, your fixed accounts, like those things hold you down. Because the mistake that most people make when it comes to retirement is they make emotional decisions because they're not clear how their money is supposed to work in retirement. So you want to make sure your foundation is tight, right? That's the most important thing. I had a client, she had a lot of issues with her family. Her daughter unfortunately had died and stuff like that. And when we first talked, she had about 400,000 in her TSP. But because her daughter had died, it was a tragic death. And you know, she just had a lot going on, stress with retirement and stuff. And when we initially talked, she had a 400,000. When we talked about a year and a half later, we got her a call and she just was like, "Miss Smith, you're gonna be so mad at me." I'm like, "Mad at me for what?" And then she was like, "I just blew through my TSP." And I was like, "What you mean?" And so we talked, and she had like 105,000 left in her TSP. And now, mind you, this lady had worked for over 30 years. But what does that mean? An emotional situation got out, which I understand. And she just started spending emotionally. And I've heard many stories like that. But you want to make sure your foundation is clear when it comes to your legacy money, where your emergency money is going to come from, how you're going to utilize it in case of emergencies. That way you have the accountability and the plan. And so the next thing we have is the walls. That's your insulation. The two things that are going to impact you the most in retirement that you have zero control over is well, you have 90% no control over. You can make some decisions, right? Is taxes and inflation. Taxes, obviously, that's legislated. Like your tax bracket, they extended the Trump tax cuts this year, but if that didn't get extended, then taxes will go up a little bit. But there's also a back door that they created in 2019 to siphon away those tax cuts from the middle class with the 10-year rule on traditional IRAs. And we've talked about that over and over again, so I won't go into that now. But that's tax law that didn't exist less than 10 years ago, but now it's a big deal for you for you retiring and your heirs. Like that, there's a lot more taxes that you will owe that you and your family will be taxed on that didn't exist 10 years ago with the same money that you already had there, right? They can legislate that money, right? Any money that's in a qualified account, like a traditional TSP, traditional IRA, 401k, that money hasn't been taxed. The government can create laws on how much they tax you, when they tax you, how they tax your heirs. They can legislate that, and you have no control over that. And so the only thing you can do, and me too, is make sure we do proper tax planning, meaning Roth conversions. That's why Roth is such an important thing to have in your retirement, because once you do the Roth, you're basically paying your exit fee out of that situation. And so you want to make sure you have proper tax planning to avoid that, so that way you have control over the money. Because once the money's in a Roth account and it's taxed, who cares what the legislation is? Your money's already out of that situation. You don't have to worry about it. Next thing is inflation. Inflation obviously can fluctuate, right? When COVID hit, we had to pump money into the economy. Inflation went up. Now it's down, but it fluctuates. Inflation also is very industry specific. So healthcare, obviously, we've been hearing on the news, is getting ready to jump up in costs. That's going to impact you. That's going to impact people retired, and their cost of living is increasing by the numbers that they're talking about on the news. So what you have to do is make sure your money is increasing in value at a pace that can offset those type of things. And so that's why sitting your money in the G fund, even though you don't see losses on your dashboard, you're losing buying power. Even TSP.gov says that right when you click the G fund, like it's a warning signal. I mean, what is a warning on the G fund site that tells you this investment may not offset inflation and cause issues with buying power. It says it right there in writing, plain as day, not even small print. And the last part we like to talk about is the TSP growth, which is the roof, making sure that your investments, and we say the roof because roof takes the most risk in the house. It's a metaphor, right? But you want to make sure you have the right structure when it comes to how you invest your TSP. And what that means mainly is you want to have some risk in there, meaning you want to have some C fund. See, S&P 500 is 17% this year. That's a big deal. If you had it was 17. If you have 500,000 in your TSP, 500,000 plus 17%. Oops, hold up. 500,000 plus 17%. Calculate this out. Is $85,000. That's $85,000 just because you had the money in the right account. So you want to have the right balance there, right? And so also the things changing in 2026, the contribution limits are increasing. We shared this last time. Also, the TSP Roth conversion window opens up. Where you're able to do Roth conversion within the TSP. You have to be careful with that, because if you do it while you're working, you can cause yourself to go into a higher tax bracket. It's best to do that type of stuff when you're retired. But just seek tax guidance from your accountant. You can talk to us about it, but don't just do it to do it, because you end up going to have to pay a higher number of taxes depending on how much you do.